The chamber thrummed with a restless energy, as though the very walls could feel what was about to unfold. Cameras blinked like nervous eyes, capturing every twitch, every sigh, every subtle glance across the expanse of the room. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and anxiety, a mixture that clung to the silence between flashes of whispers. Jasmine Crockett entered with a stride that was neither rushed nor hesitant, but deliberate, a rhythm born of conviction. Her sharp eyes swept the room, cataloging the expectant crowd, the lines of journalists perched on the edge of their seats, the aides hunched protectively over their tablets. Each step announced her presence, but it was her stillness, once she reached her place, that carried the greatest weight. Across from her, Megyn Kelly sat poised, the embodiment of media polish. Her tailored suit gleamed under the chamber's sterile lights, her blonde hair meticulously styled to perfection. Kelly's expression was calm, bordering on indifferent, but her fingers drummed against the table in a rhythm too subtle for cameras to catch. She knew the game. She had played it for years, turning confrontations into ratings and narratives into weapons. Jasmine tilted her head slightly, watching her opponent with an intensity that was part curiosity, part challenge. For her, this was not about spectacle. It was about responsibility. Yet she also knew that in this room, under these lights, responsibility and spectacle could never fully be separated. The murmurs grew louder, reporters whispering predictions. One voice hissed, "Crockett is going to scorch her." Another muttered back, "Kelly's too smart, she'll twist it." The tension wasn't just in the chamber, it was in the nation, divided between those who saw Kelly as a fearless truth-teller and those who knew her as a master manipulator of perception. A gavel struck, its crack ricocheting like thunder. Silence fell instantly, thick and heavy. Jasmine leaned forward, her hands clasped together, her voice low but cutting as she began. Today is not about who can talk the loudest. It's about who can face the truth when it refuses to bend. Kelly raised a brow, her lips curling ever so slightly into a practiced half-smile. "Congresswoman," she replied smoothly, her tone both respectful and edged with challenge. "I've built a career on asking hard questions. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps it's not my methods that need to change." The room vibrated with the clash, as though words alone carried the force of steel meeting steel. Jasmine didn't flinch. Instead, she allowed the words to hang in the air, her silence louder than rebuttal. She scanned the faces in the gallery, some wide-eyed with anticipation, others furrowed in skepticism. A woman in the second row gripped her phone so tightly, her knuckles turned white, already preparing to tweet the exchange. A young man scribbled notes furiously, whispering under his breath, "This is history in motion." The camera zoomed in, broadcasting every flicker of expression across the nation. To some, Kelly's poise was a mark of professionalism. To others, it was a mask, and Crockett was about to tear it away. Jasmine's voice rose again, calm but weighted with iron. "We are not here to indulge in performance. We are here to examine the patterns that have shaped public thought patterns, that have too often been poisoned by selective storytelling, by media tricks dressed as journalism." Kelly's eyes narrowed, the first crack in her composure. She crossed her arms and leaned back, exuding confidence. Yet the rhythm of her tapping fingers betrayed the calculation behind the mask. Outside the chamber, millions watched live streams, news outlets cutting into regular programming. Comment sections flared with fire. Kelly's about to destroy her. No, Crockett's the only one willing to call this out. Inside, the silence grew unbearable. Every pause in speech was an opening for judgment. Every breath drawn was a performance, intentional or otherwise. Jasmine's gaze pierced through it all. A warning, a promise, a declaration. What was coming would not just bruise reputations, it would unmask the machinery behind them. And as a gavel struck once more, to signal the session's formal opening. The real confrontation began. The room settled into an uneasy rhythm, as though everyone was bracing for a storm they could already smell on the horizon. Jasmine adjusted her papers. Though she hardly needed them, her memory was sharp, honed from years of standing in rooms where truth was a weapon and silence was complicity. She lifted her eyes, letting them sweep the chamber. This moment, she began slowly, deliberately, is not born in isolation. It has roots. And if we are to understand what stands before us today, we must trace those roots back. The audience leaned forward. This was no opening jab. This was excavation. She turned slightly, gesturing toward the screen behind her. It flickered to life, and images of Megyn Kelly's career rolled in silence. The Fox News debate stage in 2015. Kelly standing tall as she locked horns with Donald Trump. A younger Kelly anchoring primetime news, her voice firm, her questions sharpened like blades. Clips of tense exchanges, viral headlines, sound bites that had divided living rooms and flooded social media. Jasmine's voice cut through the reel like a scalpel. For years, Ms. Kelly has been hailed as a fearless voice, someone who asked the questions others feared. But I ask, who benefited from those questions? Who paid the cost? Kelly smirked faintly, turning her head just enough for the cameras to catch it. She knew her legacy, and she knew how to defend it. "Congresswoman," she said, her voice smooth as glass, "I asked the questions America wanted answered. People deserve hard truth, even when it stings." Jasmine leaned forward, her gaze unblinking. Hard truth or carefully staged provocation? The gallery stirred, a ripple of murmurs snaking through the chamber. Reporters scribbled furiously. Some leaned toward one another, whispering, "This is about to get personal." The screen behind them shifted again, this time displaying transcripts. Jasmine began to read aloud, her voice even but edged with precision. "You've called women you don't like fat pigs, dogs, slobs, and disgusting animals. Those were your words." Ms. Kelly, directed to a presidential candidate on live television. Kelly straightened, ready to counter. And that moment, "Congresswoman" was a stand against misogyny. I was the one who took the risk, the one who faced the backlash. That clip you play was not manipulation. It was journalism in its truest form. Jasmine did not flinch. "And yet," she continued, her tone tightening, "that same pattern provocation as performance emerges again and again. Question framing designed to corner, to ignite outrage. Sound bites crafted not for clarity, but for spectacle." She paused, allowing the silence to breathe. The audience felt the weight of the accusations settle, like dust on their skin. Kelly's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening for the first time. Spectacle drives attention. And attention, she said sharply, is how truth finds its way to the people. Without it, no one listens. Jasmine's lips curved into something between a smile and a warning. Or is it how bias finds its way into hearts? Is it how division becomes normalized one broadcast at a time? The screen flickered again, showing headlines. Megyn Kelly sparks outrage with Black Sada debate. Kelly questions kids on gender in heated segment. Law and order or cultural chaos? Each headline hung in the air like smoke, acrid and undeniable. Jasmine's voice grew softer, but sharper. These are not just tough questions. They are choices. Editorial choices framed as inevitabilities. And those choices shaped public thought. They hardened division. They racialized narratives. They made outrage into currency. The chamber was utterly still, save for the low hum of cameras capturing every second. A voice broke the tension, one of the older committee members leaning forward. "Congresswoman, are you suggesting Ms. Kelly's reporting was deliberately manipulative?" Jasmine turned to him, her tone respectful but unwavering. "I am suggesting that patterns speak louder than intentions. When the same tricks appear across years, across issues, across communities, it ceases to be coincidence. It becomes design. Kelly bristled. Design? Or do you mean accountability, Congresswoman? Because I've held presidents to the fire. I've challenged power structures. That is what journalism demands. Jasmine's eyes locked onto hers. And yet, you have also amplified power structures by disguising bias as inquiry. That is not what democracy demands. A sharp murmur swept the chamber, tension building like a pressure valve about to snap. Reporters outside flooded social media feeds with clips. Jasmine's deliberate dismantling of Kelly's legacy. Kelly's steely rebuttals. A clash of philosophies wrapped in two women's voices. Tweets spun into trends. Hashtag Crockett vs. Kelly. Hashtag media on trial. Inside, the air thickened. Jasmine let the silence work once more, her gaze drifting toward the gallery. She could see it on their faces: confusion, curiosity, anger, even admiration. This was no longer a hearing. This was theater, trial, and reckoning rolled into one. Her voice dropped into a low timbre, the kind that demanded attention without raising volume. America deserves to see how narratives are crafted, to understand that when media trades truth for entertainment, democracy itself is weakened. She turned back to Kelly, her final words landing like a blade. You are not just a journalist. Ms. Kelly, you are a case study in how perception becomes power. The gavel struck again, but this time it did not quiet the room. The noise of reaction gasps, whispers, the scratching of pens, the crackle of live tweets being sent rose. Like a wave, unstoppable, undeniable. And as the judge called for order, the audience knew. The roots of tension had been laid bare. The real dissection was only beginning. The air inside the chamber felt different now, thicker, heavier, as though everyone could sense the shift about to occur. Jasmine Crockett straightened her back, her shoulders squared like a soldier marching into battle. The groundwork had been laid, the history exposed, but now came the blade's first swing. She lifted a small stack of papers, the sound of shuffling pages amplified by the silence. Then she set them down, deliberately, so the microphones picked up the weight of it. For the record, Jasmine began, her voice carrying with surgical calm. We have transcripts of multiple interviews conducted by Ms. Kelly over the past decade. Not cherry-picked quotes, not isolated moments, but full transcripts. The gallery shifted, heads craned. A young journalist scribbled furiously. She's going to cut with receipts. Jasmine reached for the first sheet, holding it high. In this interview, Ms. Kelly asked her guest, quote, do you think immigrants are making American neighborhoods less safe? That framing is not neutral. It plants a conclusion inside the question itself. It does not seek truth, it steers. She let the words linger, her eyes darting across the room before settling on Kelly. Megyn adjusted in her seat, the faintest crease forming between her brows. Congresswoman, the question reflects public concern. It's a journalist's job to give voice to what citizens are asking. Jasmine's reply came sharp as flint. Or is it the journalist's job to decide which fears to amplify? Because when fear becomes the headline, it doesn't matter what the answer is. The damage has already been done. A murmur swept through. The crowd, quick and electric dot, she pressed on. Another sheet came up, the microphone catching the rasp of paper. In this debate clip from 2015, you accused a presidential candidate of misogyny with rehearsed phrasing that sparked outrage across the country. And while I stand with anyone who calls out sexism, the reality is this: the framing made you the story, not the misogyny itself. Kelly's jaw set tight. Congresswoman, I was the only journalist on that stage who dared to confront him. That was courage. Jasmine's voice lowered, steadier now, almost tender in its precision. And yet, Ms. Kelly, it wasn't courage. That became the headline. It was controversy. Controversy that you, by design or by instinct, made into your signature currency. Her words cut into the room like a scalpel into skin. Kelly leaned forward now, her voice firmer. Congresswoman, I will not apologize for asking questions that others were too afraid to raise. If that generates attention, so be it. Journalism isn't a popularity contest, it's a confrontation with reality. Jasmine's eyes glinted, catching the light. But when you choose which reality to confront, when you decide what is amplified and what is buried, that is no longer journalism. That is agenda. A gasp broke from someone in the audience. The camera zoomed tighter, the tension thick. As molasses, Jasmine leaned back slightly, her hands folded together, her tone controlled but unrelenting. This is not about whether you were brave in your career. This is about whether your methods traded nuance for notoriety. And I will show, piece by piece, how they did. She gestured again, and a staffer rolled in a cart with a screen. Clips. Queued up, the sound muted at first. Kelly's voice filled the chamber in fragments. Are you playing the race card? Why shouldn't America be afraid of Sharia law? Do you believe Black Lives Matter has contributed to violence against police? Each question hit the chamber like a hammer. Jasmine turned back to Kelly. Each of these questions is framed not to uncover truth, but to provoke outrage. They box in the guest. They force the audience into binary camps, for or against. You, us or them, ally or enemy. That is not illumination. It is division. Kelly's lips parted as if to respond, but for the first time, words did not come quickly. She inhaled sharply, eyes narrowing. Finally, she said, these questions are uncomfortable because they reflect uncomfortable realities. Are we supposed to sanitize the truth to spare feelings? Jasmine's reply came quietly, almost whisper-soft, but the microphones carried it like thunder. There is a difference between confronting reality and weaponizing fear. And you, Miss Kelly, have built a career out of knowing that difference and crossing it. The silence that followed was suffocating. The audience sat frozen, suspended in the gravity of the accusation. Then, from somewhere in the gallery, applause broke a single pair of hands clapping, defiantly before being hushed by glares and a sharp call for order. Kelly's face hardened. She met Jasmine's stare with fire now, her polished composure cracking just enough to reveal the steel beneath. Congresswoman, you may dress this up as accountability, but what you are doing is political theater. You are attacking me for doing my job. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't even blink. If holding up a mirror to your record feels like an attack, perhaps it says more about the reflection than the person holding it. The chamber erupted not in noise, but in a dense, electric silence that felt louder than any shout. Kelly shifted again, trying to recompose, but Jasmine had already leaned in, voice steady and unshaken. This is only the beginning. We are going to examine how media has shaped public thought, not with transparency, but with tricks. And by the end, the public will see exactly what those tricks cost us. The gavel cracked again, a desperate attempt to restore order. But order was already gone. The battle had begun, and the opening strike had landed. The gavel's echo still lingered when Kelly leaned forward, her posture shifting from elegant detachment to pointed defiance. She adjusted the microphone with a steady hand, her eyes locking on Jasmine as if to remind the chamber. She wasn't merely a subject under scrutiny. She was a fighter in her own right. Congresswoman, Kelly began, her voice calm but edged with steel. You call it provocation. I call it journalism. My career has been built on asking the hard questions that others avoid. Questions that cut through the politeness and force people to face uncomfortable truths. The chamber stirred. Some nodded, their expressions lit with recognition of the Kelly they had watched for years, fearless, unapologetic, unwilling to flinch. Others frowned, unsettled by how smoothly she reclaimed the narrative. Kelly didn't stop. Her tone rose, gaining momentum. I've confronted presidents, senators, CEOs. I've stood on stages where millions watched, knowing that every word might end my career. And yet, I asked those questions, not because they were easy, but because they mattered. If provocation is what it takes to hold power to account, then so be it. She let the words hang, her gaze sweeping the gallery. The camera zoomed in, broadcasting her poise to living rooms across the country. She knew the language of optics, and she was wielding it masterfully now. Jasmine remained motionless, her expression unreadable. Kelly pressed harder, sensing the opening. And what's more, Congresswoman, you sit here accusing me of manipulation, yet your very presence is political theater. This chamber, these cameras, your carefully staged outrage, are you not also performing? Are you not using me as your stage to score points with your base? Gasps rippled through the crowd. The attack was no longer defensive. It was offensive, aimed directly at Crockett's integrity. Kelly's voice sharpened, landing blow after blow. You accuse me of dividing America. But is that not what politics thrives on, division? You call my questions loaded, but every question asked in this room is too. You speak of media tricks, but you stand here wielding political ones. A wave of murmurs rolled across the gallery, the tension ratcheting up as the duel began to feel like a mirror turned back on itself. Finally, Jasmine shifted. Not much, just a tilt of the head, her chin resting briefly on her clasped fingers. Her silence was measured, intentional, letting Kelly's counterattack breathe, letting the audience hear the elegance of the dodge. Kelly leaned closer to the microphone, her voice dropping into a quieter, more pointed register. The truth, Congresswoman, is that America doesn't need you to protect them from questions. They need you to answer them. And until you do, you might want to think twice about questioning the methods of someone who's actually done it. The chamber erupted gasps, scattered applause, a reporter muttering into his recorder. Kelly's turning it around. For a moment, Kelly looked triumphant. She adjusted her papers, smoothed her jacket, her polished half-smile returning like armor freshly fitted. She had thrown her punch, and it had landed, but Jasmine did not recoil. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing just enough for the cameras to catch. Her voice came soft, deliberate, heavy with intent. Are you finished, Miss Kelly? Kelly blinked, slightly caught off guard by the stillness of the reply. I've made my point. Jasmine's hands unfolded, palms resting lightly against the table. Then let us address it plainly. You accuse me of theater. Perhaps you're right. This room is a stage. But there is a difference between performance and truth. And the truth is, Miss Kelly, that you have built your career on a performance so skillful that millions mistake it for journalism. Kelly's lips tightened, but Jasmine pressed forward. You call it courage to confront power, but you never admit that your framing has repeatedly punched down on immigrants, on women of color, on movements fighting for justice. Courage does not exploit. Courage uplifts. Courage risks reputation to protect those who have none. Tell me, Miss Kelly, how many times has your courage been aimed not at presidents, but at those already struggling to be heard? The room froze. Kelly opened her mouth, but no words came at first. The pause was deadly. Cameras caught it. Commentators would replay it. Memes would be born from it. Finally, she forced a reply. I gave those issues a platform. I asked the questions the public wanted asked. Jasmine leaned in further, her voice a whisper sharpened into a blade. No, you asked the questions the public had been taught to fear, and you wrapped them in legitimacy, broadcasting prejudice under the guise of inquiry. That is not journalism. That is manipulation. The audience gasped again, louder this time, the chamber pulsing with the weight of the clash. Kelly's face hardened. her professional veneer intact, but the edges fraying under Crockett's relentless calm. She straightened her papers, forced a smile, and said, "History will decide who served the truth." Jasmine's reply came instantly. "History is already deciding, and it is watching right now." The gavel struck again, but this time it could not silence the storm. Reporters dashed out tweets, hashtags surged, and the narrative shifted once more. Kelly had counterpunched, but Crockett had absorbed it, turning defense into a deeper revelation. The battle line was drawn sharper than ever. The chamber seemed to lean forward, as if drawn by an invisible force. Jasmine Crockett's eyes scanned the room, resting briefly on each face before she began. Her voice was steady, deliberate, the kind that made people hang on every word. "This is where the story deepens," she said softly. "This is where we see not just clever questions, but patterns that have consequences beyond ratings and applause." The screens behind her flickered again, and clips rolled silently. A holiday special where a Black Santa became viral flashpoint, interviews framing urban crime in ways that subtly coded race, segments questioning the legitimacy of social movements led by people of color. Each frame, each clip, hung in the air like evidence not just of media strategy, but of cultural shaping. "Ms. Kelly," Jasmine continued, her voice gaining intensity, "you have a remarkable ability to frame issues so that they seem neutral, objective, even fair. But the pattern is clear. Who bears the brunt of your framing? Who is made vulnerable by the narratives you choose to amplify?" Kelly shifted in her seat, her polished composure beginning to show cracks. "Congresswoman, the questions I asked were intended to explore the issues. They were never personal attacks. I never aimed to harm anyone." Jasmine's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Intent is not impact. And the impact, Miss Kelly, is undeniable." She leaned forward, hands resting lightly on the table. "Consider the young black student vilified after your segment on law and order. Consider the immigrant mother demonized by your framing of cultural debates. These are not statistics, they are lives." The chamber was silent, save for the hum of the microphones. The tension was palpable, electric. Every eye in the room was on Crockett as she laid bare the stakes of what many had dismissed as mere provocative journalism. A staffer rolled in a screen, showing side-by-side clips of Kelly's interviews over the years. Jasmine narrated as the footage played. "Notice how certain guests are interrupted more often. Notice which narratives are emphasized and which are ignored. This is not coincidence. This is editorial choice. And those choices, when repeated across decades, shape perceptions of entire communities." Kelly opened her mouth to respond, but Jasmine held up a hand. "I am not here to vilify you personally, Miss Kelly. I am here to expose the architecture of influence you have participated in, to show how media, when wielded without accountability, becomes a tool that enforces bias." Her gaze swept across the room, and make no mistake, this is not abstract. These are lives, families, and futures that are affected every time a question is framed to provoke fear rather than foster understanding. Kelly's jaw tightened. Her voice, usually so measured, carried a sharper edge this time. "Congresswoman, are you suggesting that I am responsible for every perception the public forms? That my framing somehow creates prejudice?" Jasmine leaned in, voice soft but cutting. "I am suggesting that when you consistently elevate fear over context, when you repeatedly position certain communities as other, responsibility is unavoidable. Media does not exist in a vacuum. Words do not vanish. They echo, and those echoes shape reality." The gallery shifted, the weight of her words pressing down. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing not only her statements, but the gravity with which she delivered them. Outside, social media feeds were already ablaze. Hashtag Crockett calls out bias. Hashtag media influence exposed. Hashtag Kelly under scrutiny. Jasmine's voice grew quieter, almost intimate, yet each word struck like a hammer. The legacy of these segments is visible in schools, in neighborhoods, in how communities perceive each other. It is visible in fear, masquerading as concern, in stereotypes dressed as news. This is why we must examine not just what is said, but how it is said and why it is said. Kelly's composure faltered further. Congresswoman, I report what people need to hear. That is my role. Jasmine shook her head, deliberate, measured. No, Ms. Kelly, you report what the narrative demands. And when the narrative is shaped to ignite fear, the consequences extend far beyond your studio. A hush fell over the chamber. Every journalist, every aide, every spectator could feel the tension, thick and suffocating. It was not just a clash of two women. It was a confrontation between two visions of responsibility. One seeking ratings, one seeking justice. Jasmine's hands rested lightly on the table as she concluded, voice steady and resonant. America deserves to know how narratives are shaped, who benefits and who suffers. And in this chamber today, the truth is coming into sharp focus. The patterns are no longer invisible. They are exposed. Kelly's eyes darted briefly to the screen, then back at Jasmine. For the first time, she was visibly off balance, unsure. How to reclaim the narrative without sounding defensive, without revealing that the meticulously constructed shield she relied upon was under siege. Jasmine's gaze did not waver. This is not personal. This is accountability. And it is long overdue. The gavel struck again, but the sound could not contain the weight of the revelation. Murmurs rolled through the chamber. Outside, millions watched as the nation's conversation about media bias, race, and responsibility shifted in real-time.in. That charged silence, the racial undercurrents were no longer subtle. They had been illuminated, dissected, and placed before the public in stark, undeniable clarity. The chamber seemed to tighten, the air vibrating with anticipation. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward slightly, her voice calm yet imbued with authority. What we've discussed so far, the framing, the patterns, the subtle biases, these are not just stylistic choices. They are strategic, they are calculated, and they are powerful. She gestured toward the screen behind her. Clips cued silently. Heated panel debates, viral interview soundbites, segments where political outrage spiked within hours of airing. Headlines flashed. Kelly questions Trump. Internet erupts. Megyn Kelly sparks controversy with Black Santa. Viewers shocked by polarizing segment. Notice a pattern? Jasmine's voice sliced through the room. Notice how these moments are engineered to provoke emotion before understanding. Outrage becomes the product, and the public the consumer. Kelly's eyes narrowed, a flash of unease crossing her polished composure. Congresswoman, are you seriously suggesting that I orchestrate outrage? Jasmine's lips curved in a controlled, almost imperceptible smile. I am suggesting that the framing, timing, and repetition of these segments functioned in a way that maximized shock and, yes, outrage. Every choice wording, camera angle, even the pauses was optimized to provoke reaction, not merely inform. She leaned forward, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. Let's examine the interview with the candidate discussing immigration. The questions weren't neutral. They forced a moral panic, and within hours, social media had exploded. Comment sections filled with anger, fear, and division. This was not a spontaneous reaction. It was a predictable consequence. Kelly shifted slightly, her voice steady but defensive. Journalism often generates reaction. If people respond passionately, it's because the topics matter. That is engagement, not manipulation. Jasmine's eyes glinted, sharp and unwavering. Engagement is not the issue. The issue is intent and effect. When outrage is deliberately, Amplified, when it is predictable and provoked, it ceases to be engagement. It becomes a tool, weaponized to reinforce narratives, to frame debates, and to polarize audiences. The gallery murmured. Some leaned forward, scribbling notes. Others exchanged glances, realizing the significance of the assertion. A reporter whispered into his recorder, "She's tracing the architecture of manipulation, line by line." Jasmine continued, her tone intensifying. "Look at the headlines following these segments: fear, scandal, division. Each segment followed the same formula: shock, question, amplify, repeat. And the most vulnerable voices, the marginalized communities, the activists, the dissenters, were often caught in the crossfire." Kelly inhaled sharply, her hands resting on the table. "Congresswoman, I report on issues of public concern. If outrage results, that is the public engaging with reality." Jasmine shook her head slowly. The calm in her demeanor belied the force of her words. "No, Miss Kelly, the outrage is not incidental. It is engineered. And when outrage is engineered, it guides public perception, shapes discourse, and influences political outcomes. This is the weaponization of media, and it has consequences far beyond your studio. The cameras caught every flicker of expression. The chamber, once quiet, now vibrated with tension. Reporters typed furiously, some already crafting live segments, summarizing the claims. She paused, letting the weight settle. Consider the clip where Ms. Kelly challenged protesters during a national debate. The framing was not neutral. The questions forced a defensive posture, creating viral moments that inflamed public anger. Minutes later, opinion sections were flooded with outrage, hashtags trended, and viewers were divided exactly as designed. Kelly's jaw tightened, her voice finally cracking under the weight of accusation. "Congresswoman, these were real conversations about real events. If people reacted, that is not manipulation, it is democracy." Jasmine's eyes bore into hers, steady and unyielding. Democracy cannot thrive when outrage is manufactured, public trust erodes, civility frays, and when the most powerful tools of perception news platforms, broadcast segments, are wielded to provoke rather than inform, the public becomes a battlefield. The room was silent, every listener holding their breath. Jasmine let the gravity of her words sink in and pressed forward. This is why accountability matters, not simply for the individual journalist, but for the society they influence. Patterns repeated over time, amplified across networks, create a culture where anger outweighs reason, spectacle outweighs substance, and polarization becomes the norm. Kelly's hands clenched subtly. She rose slightly, her voice low and deliberate. "Congresswoman, you are accusing me of orchestrating social unrest. That is a serious claim. And yet, all you offer are interpretations, not intent." Jasmine leaned in, voice quiet but cutting. "Interpretation is powerful when it's supported by consistent evidence. Every segment, every question, every carefully timed pause, these are not isolated. They are part of a repeatable pattern. And patterns, Miss Kelly, tell the truth even when words try to obscure it." A murmur swept through the chamber. Reporters jotted frantically. The audience's attention was rapt. Outside, millions watched live as the debate escalated from accusation to revelation. Jasmine's gaze swept the room once more. America deserves media that informs, not inflames, that questions, not manipulates. And by dissecting these patterns, today we expose not only the methods, but also the consequences, the social fractures, the divided communities, the cultivated outrage that masquerades as engagement. Kelly's expression faltered, subtle but unmistakable. She straightened. Her suit cleared her throat, but her usual confidence had shifted. She was no longer simply defending a career. She was confronting the moral weight of her influence, Jasmine concluded, voice steady, unwavering. This is not about personal attack. It is about accountability. The weaponization of outrage is real, and the public deserves to see it laid bare. The gavel struck, but the sound did little to calm the atmosphere. Outside, social media exploded. Inside, every eye followed Jasmine's gaze, realizing that the argument was no longer about ratings. It was about responsibility, power, and the consequences of words amplified into fury. The stage was set. The weapon of outrage had been revealed, and the next moves would determine not only reputations, but the very conversation about media, influence, and truth in America. The chamber seemed smaller now, the tension so thick it pressed against every shoulder. Jasmine Crockett's eyes scanned the room, briefly resting on every journalist, aide, and observer. Then she spoke, her voice calm yet charged with certainty. The true measure of media influence, she began, is not in the studio or the broadcast booth. It is here, in the public response, in the way millions absorb, amplify, and react. Behind her, screens flickered to life. Tweets streamed across the display, punctuated by viral video clips and public comment threads. Crockett is calling out the media I thought I trusted. Kelly's questions sound different now. Why didn't anyone notice this before? Jasmine let the footage play briefly, allowing the murmurs of the chamber to swell. Then she leaned forward, hands folded, her tone deliberate. Ms. Kelly, the moments we've discussed your segments, your interviews, your debates, did not exist in isolation. They traveled. They were shared. They were dissected by millions. And the consequences? They were immediate and lasting. Kelly shifted, her composure taut, yet unbroken. Congresswoman, public reaction is unpredictable. I cannot control how millions respond to journalism. Jasmine's gaze sharpened. No, you cannot, but you can influence it. You designed questions to provoke strong emotion. You chose which narratives to highlight and which to bury. And when millions react with anger, fear, or division, that is a predictable outcome. That is influence. That is power wielded consciously or not. The screens behind her shifted, showing side-by-side analysis, heated comment threads, social media engagement spikes, and viral moments stemming directly from Kelly's broadcasts. Each moment was a spark, igniting public debate, often fraught with misunderstanding and conflict. Notice, Jasmine continued, how the public repeats your framing, how outrage spreads faster than reason. This is not accidental. This is media shaping perception, framing debate, and driving emotional currency. A young reporter whispered, "She's showing the anatomy of influence." Live. Kelly's eyes narrowed, her voice steady but sharper. Congresswoman, those are discussions people wanted to have. I simply provided a platform. Jasmine tilted her head slightly, her tone almost gentle but lethal in precision. A platform that guides perception, Miss Kelly, that amplifies certain fears while ignoring others. That turns nuance into outrage and debate into spectacle. You are not just broadcasting. You are engineering reaction. The chamber grew quieter. The weight of her words sank in. Every journalist, every official, every viewer felt the tension of accountability pressing down. Jasmine gestured to the screen again. Headlines flashed. Kelly sparks social media firestorm. Outrage erupts after debate segment. Public divided by viral question. Each story a testament to the power of carefully framed words. You see, Miss Kelly, Jasmine said, voice steady, the public mirrors your framing. Millions respond not just to what you ask, but how you ask it. And when questions are crafted to inflame, the public becomes a battlefield. Citizens argue, friends feud, communities fracture, all over the narratives you help construct. Kelly's hands rested firmly on the table, her face a mask of composed frustration. Congresswoman, The public reaction is organic. People are free to interpret, respond, and critique. That is democracy. Jasmine's eyes glinted. Democracy thrives on informed discourse, not manipulated outrage. Your questions have consequences, Miss Kelly, and those consequences echo far beyond the studio walls. Every viral clip, every trending hashtag, every social media debate, these are the ripples of influence that shape public consciousness. And yes, they often divide, distract, and distort. She paused, letting silence stretch. Every camera in. The room lingered on her expression. Every journalist's pen froze in anticipation. And let's be clear, she continued, softer now, almost conversational. This is not about vilifying a single journalist. This is about recognizing this responsibility of media in shaping thought, emotion, and society. When influence is wielded carelessly, millions pay the price, not for what is true, but for what is framed as truth. Kelly leaned back slightly, a subtle exhale betraying her resolve. Congresswoman, you make it sound as though intent does not matter. People choose how to interpret. I cannot be responsible for every reaction. Jasmine's gaze did not waver. Intent may be unknowable, Miss Kelly, but pattern is undeniable. And when patterns consistently provoke outrage, amplify division, and weaponize emotion, the effect is clear. Media becomes a tool of polarization, whether or not that was the stated goal. The chamber was electric, every observer absorbing the moral weight of her argument. The narrative had shifted. It was no longer about individual segments or isolated clips. It was about the machinery of influence, and Crockett had placed Kelly squarely within it. Finally, Jasmine allowed herself a brief pause, her voice dropping to a resonant, controlled cadence. Public reaction is not merely feedback. It is a reflection, a mirror, held up to the choices made in framing, in questioning, in deciding what the public sees and hears. And the public is watching, always watching. The gavel struck, attempting to restore order, but the echo was hollow. The audience, both inside and out, had already absorbed the lesson. Outrage had been weaponized, and the responsibility rested not only in the questions asked, but in the way they were asked. Jasmine sat back, letting the silence do its work. The stage was set for the next phase, connecting the public's response back to accountability, ethics, and the moral cost of media influence. The chamber seemed to quiet, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Jasmine Crockett's eyes scanned the room with unwavering intensity. We've traced the framing, the patterns, the weaponization of outrage, she began, voice calm but piercing. Now let us confront the question of accountability, the legal and ethical obligations that accompany influence. She gestured toward a series of reports on the screen, journalistic codes of ethics, industry guidelines, and documented analyses of media impact. Journalism is more than a career. It is a responsibility. The power to inform carries the duty to do so with accuracy, fairness, and integrity. When that responsibility is compromised, when framing becomes manipulation, it is not merely a lapse, it is a breach. Kelly leaned forward, her polished composure taut but unshaken. Congresswoman, journalism is not a courtroom. It cannot be judged by hypothetical standards of impact. My role is to report, to question, to challenge. That is my ethical duty. Jasmine's eyes glinted, a quiet fire behind them. And yet, Miss Kelly, the ethical code does not exist in a vacuum. It exists to guide journalists when their influence could harm individuals, communities, or public trust. The standards are clear. Avoid sensationalism, do not mislead, and ensure that the vulnerable are not exploited for narrative effect. She leaned in, voice lowering but sharpened with precision. When fear is amplified for clicks, when outrage is provoked for attention, When subtle bias is repeated across decades, the consequences are legal, ethical, and moral. Every viral segment, every trending hashtag, every manipulated perception carries weight. A staffer rolled in documents clips, transcripts, internal memos that highlighted patterns in Kelly's career. Jasmine picked them up, setting them deliberately on the table. These are not accusations in the abstract. These are examples where framing, selective editing, and provocative questioning may have crossed ethical boundaries, where the line between information and manipulation blurred dangerously. Kelly's jaw tightened. Congresswoman, you speak of boundaries, but the law does not dictate editorial choices. And ethics are often subjective. Jasmine's reply was deliberate, cutting through the chamber's tension like a blade. Ethics may involve judgment, yes, but patterns reveal intent, or at the very least, recklessness. Repetition of provocative framing, targeting marginalized groups, amplifying fear, these are measurable actions, and their effects are undeniable. The public deserves transparency, and so does the profession. She paused, letting her words sink. The room, once buzzing with anticipation, now hung heavy with quiet realization. Every journalist, every aide, every observer understood the stakes. This was not just about opinion. This was about the moral contract between the media and society. Jasmine's voice grew softer, yet more compelling. It is one thing to report a story. It is another to create one. To manufacture outrage, to steer perception, to weaponize narratives. That is a choice, and choices have consequences. Kelly's eyes flickered, betraying a hint of unease. She opened her mouth, paused, then said cautiously, Congresswoman, you are conflating interpretation with manipulation. Intent matters. Jasmine's gaze held firm. Intent matters, but so do outcomes. You may have intended to ask questions, to challenge, to illuminate. Yet the predictable outcome was fear, division, and polarization. The ethical reckoning arises not just from intent, but from the measurable impact your choices have had over time. The gallery shifted. The journalists scribbled furiously. Social media feeds outside were already buzzing. Hashtag ethics in journalism, hashtag Crockett calls out media, hashtag Kelly under scrutiny. The debate had moved from the studio to the conscience of the nation. Jasmine pressed on. Accountability is not about punishment alone. It is about correction, about recognition that the influence wielded by media carries profound responsibilities. And when those responsibilities are ignored, the public, society, and history will take note. Kelly exhaled slowly, a subtle but noticeable change in demeanor. Congresswoman, are you implying that I am personally accountable for societal reaction? That I am legally or ethically liable for every outcome? Jasmine's voice, low and deliberate, cut through the air. I am implying that professional ethics are not abstract ideals, they are commitments. Commitments to truth, fairness, and the protection of those who cannot defend themselves. And when repeated choices erode those commitments, accountability is inevitable, not just in perception, but in principle. The room was tense, every eye on the exchange. Jasmine leaned back, slightly, allowing the weight of her argument to resonate. This is not about personal attack. It is about professional responsibility. It is about the moral imperative that accompanies influence. And it is about ensuring that the public, who relies on your platform for information, is not misled, manipulated, or harmed in the process. Kelly's hands tightened on the table. Congresswoman, I have always believed that journalism should provoke thought, challenge power, and inform the public. Jasmine's gaze did not waver. And challenging power is noble when it serves truth. When it provokes fear, inflames division, or exploits vulnerabilities, it ceases to serve truth. It becomes spectacle. And that is the ethical and legal reckoning that cannot be ignored. A gavel struck, but the sound was almost ceremonial. The message had landed. Inside the chamber, and outside in the eyes of millions watching live, the debate had moved beyond personalities. It had become a discourse on responsibility, ethics, and the very principles that underpin public trust in media. Jasmine sat back, composed yet unyielding, letting the gravity of her words settle over the room. The stage had been set for the next phase, connecting influence and accountability directly to the personal stakes of those affected by media manipulation. The chamber seemed quieter, yet heavier, as Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, letting the gravity of the moment settle. "We've discussed framing, outrage, and ethics," she began, voice calm but edged with intensity. "But what does it matter if no one pays the human price? Let's speak plainly. These are not abstract consequences. These are lives, affected in ways too often invisible to those outside the spotlight." Behind her, screens flickered to life with stills, video clips, and news segments. A young immigrant student forced to defend herself against public scrutiny. A community activist vilified for challenging local policy. Families caught in the viral echo of a segment meant to provoke fear. The images were stark, almost painfully intimate. "Miss Kelly," Jasmine continued, voice steady, "when you frame issues with selective questions, when fear and division are amplified, the consequences extend far beyond ratings. Entire communities feel the impact. The individuals depicted in your segments, sometimes nameless, often powerless, carry the weight of your framing." Kelly shifted, her polished composure taut, but her eyes betrayed unease. "Congresswoman, the responsibility for public reaction does not lie solely with the reporter. People interpret information differently." Jasmine's gaze sharpened. Interpretation matters, but the power of repetition, emphasis, and selective framing shapes those interpretations. A student called a criminal, a mother called negligent, a community called dangerous. These are not mere interpretations. These are reputations damaged, trust eroded, opportunities lost. A reporter muttered under his breath, capturing every word. Outside, millions watched as the argument transitioned from theory to tangible consequence. Jasmine gestured toward the screens again. "Consider the story of Mollick Thompson, a young activist whose interview was clipped and refrained to suggest radicalism rather than advocacy. Within hours, his personal information circulated online. Threats arrived. His family received calls, questioning their loyalty, all from a segment that appeared balanced to the casual viewer." Kelly's lips pressed into a thin line, her voice tight. "Congresswoman, those outcomes were never my intent. I reported on the events as they unfolded." Jasmine's tone was calm, almost gentle, but heavy with conviction. "Intent is insufficient when measurable harm follows. Every clip, every framing choice, every edited pause carries consequence. You cannot separate the narrative from the lives it touches." She leaned forward, hands lightly resting on the table. "And Mollick is not an isolated case. There's Sofia Alvarez, whose community organizing was repeatedly questioned under the guise of impartial reporting. Her nonprofit funding was delayed because donors feared controversy that stemmed directly from your framing. These are not hypotheticals. They are consequences." The chamber shifted, a collective inhale palpable. Journalists scribbled, frantically, capturing names, events, and the narrative arc Jasmine was constructing. "Miss Kelly," Jasmine said, her voice firm, "you have the platform, the reach, and the power to shape public discourse. And with that power comes responsibility. Those who have been harmed, whose reputations were weaponized for ratings or viral moments, deserve recognition. They deserve accountability." Kelly's jaw tightened, but she forced a composed tone. "Congresswoman, the public is aware of context, They can discern and they can critique. Jasmine's eyes did not waver. Context is often invisible when clips are shared, edited, and stripped of nuance. And the people caught in that friction, students, activists, families, cannot defend themselves on the same stage. That is the human cost. That is what it means when outrage is weaponized and ethics are ignored.